Welcome to Power and Purpose. I'm Amanda Sloat.
And I'm Nathalie Tocci.
Today we are joined by Arancha González, Dean of the Paris School of International Affairs at Sciences Po in Paris, the first woman to hold this prestigious position. Before joining academia, Arancha had a distinguished career in public service, including serving as Spain's foreign minister and holding senior positions in the United Nations, World Trade Organizations, and European Commission. We'll be talking today about France, Spain, Europe's role in the world, and her fascinating career. Arancha, welcome to the show.
Very happy to be with you.
So, Arancha, fantastic for you to be with us. And I wanted to start with you by talking about Europe, which is really a passion that you, Amanda, and I think all share. I find, often listening to you and reading you, that you have, particularly at this point in time, a refreshingly more hopeful view on Europe than what you would often hear. I tend to often be perhaps slightly darker with you. So I guess I'm asking you this question to do some lifting up. My personal pessimism about this often stems from the fact that in many respects, Europe used to swim with the tide. It used to live in a world that was multilateral, that was rules-based, that was integrating, and in a sense, kind of Europe represented a kind of microcosm or a mesocosm of that. So it kind of lived in a world where it felt comfortable. And now we often talk about the world being driven by power politics, crude power, talk a lot about defense. And this is not Europe's comfort zone. How can we, as Europe, as Europeans, as European Union, adapt to a world in which power politics is the name of the game? Can we transform without losing our soul?
Yeah, for many decades, Europe was a mini version of the world. And this is why Europe felt very comfortable. Not that the world didn't go through difficulties. Not that Europe did not go through difficulties. We have gone through huge difficulties. As a latecomer to Europe, I'm now talking about Spain, who only joined the European Union after the death of the dictator. I probably appreciate a little bit more how important this unfinished Europe was. But today, the world has separated from the EU. The world has become a more hostile place. And so Europe has a choice to make. And if I hear what Europeans want, they want Europe to remain this very specific space, which combines competitiveness, solidarity, and openness in a democratic space. They want this to remain, this European option to remain. But for that, obviously, Europe has to toughen. It has to become tougher because the world has become tougher. And this is where we are. And I'm hopeful, Nathalie, for a very simple reason. Because when I look at the world and I look at Europe, and I don't look only in macro terms, we've got a certain tendency to look at macro, GDP is this, growth is this. I look at micro. I look at well-being. And when I look at well-being, I'm hopeful. In Europe, we live longer. Child mortality is lower. Inequalities are smaller. Homicides are lower. Student debt is lower. Poverty rates are lower. Public debt is lower. This is also Europe. This is why I'm hopeful. I want to see the glass half full because this is how I think this energy from the European citizen can be transformed into more integration, which is the only way forward to keep this European option alive.
If one were to find themselves behind a Rawlsian veil of ignorance, I guess kind of still living in Europe would probably be the option that many, if not most people in the world would actually go for. I think you're absolutely right.
It certainly seems like a good option to me as an American exile here in Europe. Building on that, Arancha, I wanted to ask, one of the things that seems to be forcing Europe to toughen up a little bit these days is the response to President Trump and the attacks that he's been making on Europe. You're a former Spanish politician. You're currently sitting in Paris and closely observing French politics. And so I'm interested in your view of how Europe is responding to Trump. Over the last year, we saw many Europeans choose to be quite deferential, to try and placate him, not to push back on things. And strikingly, both Macron and in his own way, and Sanchez have been two of the European politicians in the last couple of months that have been pushing back the strongest. And so I'm curious your assessment of how Europe has been approaching him. And in particular, there's a lot of articles appearing recently about France and Gaullism and strategic autonomy, and whether France has, of course, been right all of these decades and Europe should have listened to Paris much longer ago to not be in this weak position that they are in today.
Yeah, let's look at the structural and then at the particular, because I don't want to confuse the two. I think structurally, what we are seeing seen from Europe is a huge division in America. It's a division in almost two halves of the country. And the difference between these two halves is enormous. One half just has a very inward looking, it has a very pessimistic outlook in the world. It wants to recover some form of greatness. And the other half is more open. It's more engaged with the rest of the world, understands that the greatness of America comes from its engagement with the rest of the world. But the difference between those two sometimes is so thin that at every election in the US, we just hold our breath. And maybe we've learned that we cannot just simply hold our breath every 4 years. That we cannot have such a structural dependency. And therefore, we have to become stronger in our own way, that we have to be more autonomous, more capable of defending what we stand for, irrespective of where there's a structural division in the US ends up every 4 years. So that's the structural part. And then we've got the particular, the how to deal with the current US administration. And I can tell you, Amanda, that my own experience from the first Trump administration is that the US president does not like weakness.
Sure, absolutely.
He doesn't respect weakness. And so when you see where we may want to see compromise, he sees weakness. And that's a reality, which is why I've been advocating that we Europeans, had to be a bit tougher. Now, not reckless, not antagonistic, not unnice, just simply more capable of defending what we want to stand for. We also are sovereign, right? In this world of sovereigns, we also have our own views on what this sovereignty is. So, yeah, this is, I think, little by little, with the passing of time, where the center of gravity of the European Union is moving, because we've kind of seen the writing on the wall. And we've, gone through a set of episodes from the Tambury deal last August, agreed a trade deal with an administration that only to find out a few months later that, where it was this much tariffs, now is so much higher. We've read the national security strategy. We've read the national defense strategy. We've heard the speeches of the vice president and the secretary of state. And therefore, we are now being more sober and probably a bit tougher. And that's okay, because we want to defend our own interests too. And that's important.
I definitely agree that this is what we should be doing, and this is what we should have learned from the last year. I wonder, though, whether this is actually what we're learning, in the sense that you do indeed see some signs. And I think, the reaction to Trump's threats on Greenland was certainly one sign of a kind of toughening up. And yet what you also see is that as soon as you're given half a kind of phony chance to step back into flattery, you take it, right? I mean, think about the European reaction. I know it's been a divided reaction, but let's say the majority of European officialdom's reaction, for example, to Marco Rubio's speech at the Munich Security Conference, that was, fundamentally, I think, not that different from that of J.D. Vance's speech last year. But because it was couched in kind of we, the West kind of language, Europeans kind of jumped onto it and kind of looked at it as a sign of reassurance. So I wonder whether we can and we are keeping up the toughness and the stamina in the sense of that toughness, or whether, the minute in which we get dangled kind of half a fake carrot, we basically go for it.
Yeah, I pay less attention to the applauses and the smiles. Sometimes you just have to smile. And I want to look more at what is being done. I will judge Europeans' desire to defend their own interests by what it is done. And if I look at what is being done, yes, slowly. It's not easy when you are 27 and you've got to move this machinery forward and build consensus. Today, building consensus is extra complicated, but I think the direction of travel for the European Union is pretty clear. Governments are spending more and doing more to improve defense and security, to the point that we now have the US complaining that Europe maybe is going a little bit too European on defense.
We'd still like you to buy our kit.
Yeah, okay. But sorry, we are also in the world of not being in a position to have the cake and eat it, right? We've understood that we had to be more serious about our security and our defense. And I think this is the direction of travel, but it will be also with greater European industry and industrial base development. It's what we are seeing with slowly but steadily internationalizing the euro. It is what we are seeing with the numerous trade agreements being negotiated by the European Union, a signal that our direction of travel hasn't changed. We do not want to disconnect from the rest of the world. We continue to be open to the rest of the world. So, in other words, let's judge Europe not by the smiles or the claps, but rather by the euros.
I appreciate your optimism and hope things continue to play out in that direction. Well, I'm sure the three of us could talk about transatlantic relations for the rest of the day, but wanted to move to talking about you and your story. I have to say, for those who are not able to see us, Arancha is holding up a pin that says, "Don't be an optimist or a pessimist, but be an activist," which is actually a great transition point to talking about you and your career, since you have played that role in government capacities, both as a civil servant and then as a politician. But I want to go back to something you started with, which was Spain coming late, in a sense, to the European project because of the dictatorship under Franco. You were born in the Basque Country, growing up during the height of violence by ETA, the group seeking Basque independence, and you came of age during Spain's transition to independence during Franco's death. And so I'm curious how that childhood, that political frame of reference at the time, has shaped how you see Europe now, and also has shaped how your career trajectory started to develop already from a young age.
Yeah, for me, growing up, I was born in a dictatorship, and my childhood took place in a dictatorship. I know what it is not to have freedom. I know what it is to demonstrate for your freedoms and for your rights, which is why I'm very marked by democracy. For me, growing up, Europe was democracy, was a light in a very great country, was a ray of hope, but it was a democratic hope, which is why I always put a premium in Europe to maintaining this space of not only collective progress, not only collective freedoms, but also individual freedoms, because I have lived in a space where these individual freedoms were not there. So growing up, for me, it was all about moving into the light. I devoured every publication that I could, every newspaper. I was living in the Basque Country, very close to France. So I remember going with my parents, just crossing the border to the other side, not only because the jeans and the t-shirts look more appetizing on the other side, but also because you could buy the books and buy the newspapers that you could not read on the other side. I'm very much shaped by this Europe. And this is why I'm European by definition, because this was the project that meant so much for our family and for so many Spaniards.
I understand you also spent a lot of time in England as a child and that your mother wanted you to study foreign languages because what? She could not learn them. She had not learned them as a child. And you speak what? Sort of 6 languages now. So really are a true European in that sense.
Yeah, I remember when we were small, I've got 2 brothers, and she would always say, you have to learn languages. You don't know how lucky you are. When I was a kid, I wanted to learn languages and I couldn't. So please, please, this is what will open so many doors. This is what will help you connect with the world. And right she was. So yeah, I did French at school. I did English private. And then when I felt I could take a third one, I took German. And then, at some point after doing my university years, I went to Brussels. And then all these languages were so helpful because you could connect with so many people. And it really brought you close, right? You got this not only work-wise, but friendship-wise, the world was so much bigger. So I guess it's given me an appetite for looking beyond my borders. I was born in the countryside. I lived in a small village during my first years. And I love going back to my little home and my little territory. And I'm very local about that. But I love this idea that there is no contradiction between having very deep roots and still wanting to open the window to the rest of the world that has so much to offer. And from where you can learn so much,
So Europe was, while you were growing up in a dictatorship, Europe was an idea of freedom, which you now and then experienced when you crossed the border. You then started experiencing that idea of freedom as Spain transitioned to democracy and then entered the European Union. And then, as you were mentioning right there, your first professional stop was in Brussels. And you spent quite a few years in Brussels in various positions, particularly in the European Commission. And so you were there really in the kind of golden age in many respects. Take the period that goes from the late 1980s, sort of the Single European Act onwards onto monetary integration, Eastern enlargement. I mean, this is really the moment in which really felt the European Union was in its heyday. Could you tell us a little bit about that experience? As you move from Europe as an abstract idea of freedom into a Europe that is made of kind of technicalities in Brussels, and how did those 2 visions kind of come together?
I was very lucky because I first started in the private sector as a lawyer in a law firm, and I was advising clients on trade and state aids. It was at the time of the German reunification, and I was working for a German law firm that was advising lots of companies that were purchasing in the privatization effort in Eastern Germany, were ready to invest in Eastern Germany. Right. So I saw also something that looked very much like what I had seen in my own country, is this connecting Eastern Germany with the European Union, is making sure that we would add more pieces to make this a real European Union. And then at some point, I left the private sector and I made a very conscious move to the public sector because I decided that what I wanted was not to advise clients on how to apply European law. I wanted to make European law. I thought this was super interesting. And I did this in international trade, in trade defense, defending European companies against, unfair trade practices. At the time, it was Japan and Korea. Then it was China. But at that time, it was Japan and Korea. And then, negotiating trade agreements, which is where you understand also how the international economy is not just simply a zero-sum game, that you find the spaces that can be win-win and that actually are win-win. But let me tell you, Nathalie, I saw lots of great stuff happening in the European Union, but I also saw terrible things happening in the European continent. I was part of a team that worked with the countries of the former Yugoslav Republic after the Balkan Wars had to reconstruct a set of trade agreements, I saw the damage of war, the pain that it had created, the divisions that it had generated, and how to rebuild a tissue of trust between the countries that had fought a terrible war, the scars of which were evident when I would travel to the region. So I also saw that part, Again, it strengthened my conviction that the avenue was to do this the peaceful way. The avenue was to do this bottom up. The avenue was to reconnect the economies and the people, and that would help also rebuild a continent that was once again divided by yet another war, in this case, a civil war.
So after over a decade in Brussels working in these various issues within the European Union, you moved to Geneva and a very different set of multilateral organizations, the WTO, the International Trade Center. I'm curious, given your love of Europe and the EU, what prompted the shift in city and focus?
There is what you plan, and then there is the unexpected. I got a phone call from the commissioner that was...
Absolutely. This is what we tell our students. You cannot have a life plan.
No, don't plan too much, because then things happen and then you get the phone call. And then it's happened to me a few times in my life. So the commissioner with whom I was working in Brussels became the Director General of the World Trade Organization. And he called me, he said, "Hey, why didn't you come with me and become my chief of staff?" And frankly, it was not in my books. I had always thought, oh my God, would I want to live in Geneva? And then I moved to Geneva. And my hunch was that this was a big Europe, right? I had the impression that Europe was international. And then I land in Geneva, and then I sit in the World Trade Organization in one of the first meetings. It's 2005. We are just about to go into a big ministerial gathering in Hong Kong. And I look around the room and I think, my God, this is not Europe. This is really international. The distance between two Europeans is infinitely smaller than the distance between two countries sitting in this room. The challenge is the same. How do you make these countries agree? How do you make them build consensus? How can they find that sweet spot where they all say, yeah, okay, let's go. Some of them may say, oh, okay, fine. But we go, right? The challenge was the same, but this was the international war. And I have to tell you, Amanda, I loved it, because you feel this is where you see how powerful this space is, where you rationalize the use of force, where you change this for the power of finding solutions that will allow each party to bring something back home. It's so much more powerful. So yeah, I started my career in the truly multilateral space, first in the World Trade Organization, an incredible time with huge ups and huge downs, with a hugely successful ministerial conference in 2005, with the financial crisis of 2008 and the crash of international trade, with all the ups and downs that we have seen in life. They were, the World Trade Organization was a microcosm of that.
So from the European to the international, and I guess then another rather unexpected turn is back to the national. Particularly, you become Spain's foreign minister. And I had a couple of questions. You become Spanish foreign minister, I understand, as a technocrat. You're not party political, although, of course, the government itself was a political government. And I had two questions. I mean, firstly, what is it like? What are the challenges, but also what are the relative strengths that you derive as a technocrat in a political government? And then I guess, assuming that part of that answer is going to be positive, the other side of the coin that I wanted to ask you about that experience has to do with the fact that you were then replaced. And at some point, that experience comes to an end. If you could tell us a little bit about how that came about and how you lived it. In some respects, it must have been tough.
Yeah, but let's say that was the beauty. I lived this as a beautiful experience, right? It's great to be technocratic because people underestimate you. And it's great. When they expect little, then the little that you can bring then produces miracles. So, I had done for 20 years of my life before getting to national politics, I had done that at the international level. I knew my interlocutors. I knew the codes of international life. I could be operational on day number one, but I always reminded everyone that I was a technocrat. It's a great shield. And in a way, it's easier to navigate the very aggressive, polarized political scenes that we have, is that you don't want to be that. You want to be something different. You want to be maybe less vociferous, maybe a bit more grounded, and very focused on producing results. And it was very tough because 2 months after taking office, we had the COVID pandemic. And imagine the role of a diplomat confined in your home, but with huge needs around the world that you had to find a different way to deal with. I'm very proud of lots of things that I contributed to during this period, whether it was the first ever European borrowing together to invest together. Had I been told when I joined the Commission in the 90s that I would see this in my lifetime, I would have laughed. And yet we did it. And I'm proud that I was there to do it. Spain's first feminist foreign policy, we did it. The first ever handshake with the UK around Gibraltar, this historical difficulty between the two.
That's huge.
So, in the end, when you're in politics, you don't count how many days you're going to be there. You focus on doing things. And you know that you are on borrowed time because you know that you serve at the mercy of the prime minister who appoints you and decides that your term has finished. And the only regret I had the day I left is the sense of unfinished business, because there were many things that we were working on that I would have liked to see get to the finish line. But I'm proud of what we did, and I'm happy if someone else took this and then brought the unfinished business to the finish line.
Yeah, I mean, and it's wonderful actually to hear you talk about it in this way, because I think you rightly talk about what you're proud of, and you don't talk about the fact that it ended. I mean, you talk about it in terms of regret and an unfinished business, but it kind of is the way it is. And it is not something that you have lived as a failure, which actually brings me to ask you. You talked about what you've been proud about. What would you say instead has been something that you did live as a failure?
Oh, I had a few of them during my tenure as foreign minister, but one that I see that I lived very, very profoundly was the assassination of two Spanish journalists, one journalist and one cameraman. They were kidnapped in Burkina Faso. And it was very personal to me because I knew one of them. He came from a village, small place in Navarra, and I've got family in this place. So it was very personal to me. And we tried to rescue them from the terrorists that had kidnapped them, the jihadists that had kidnapped them in Burkina Faso. And I couldn't. They were assassinated. And all I could do was to repatriate the corpses. And I remember this very often. I remember this. And I feel this as a failure. And I know how difficult it was, but I feel this as a failure because these were two incredible journalists that were specialized in conflict areas that had brought the conflicts around the world so closely to our citizens and that I couldn't rescue. So yeah, there is also tough moments. I mean, and standing in the tarmac, receiving the corpses with their families, I can tell you something that I will never forget.
You can hear in your voice the extent to which that is still weighing on you. I went with colleagues when Ambassador Chris Stevens and his colleague were returned from Libya, and the president and Secretary of State received the bodies, and it's an incredibly profound moment. So related to that, all three of us have had the experience of serving in government. There's definitely incredibly stressful moments like the one that you just described. Overall, in all of these positions, how did you manage to maintain a sense of health and well-being? And curious where you come down on this question of whether work-life balance is actually possible.
Yeah, for me is hiking. When it becomes too stressful, I go and hike. And I love nature. So just spending a bit of time out there in nature, just putting all your effort and your mind to climbing that mountain, to walking that hill, to crossing that river, that already, helps me get rid of all the anxiety and the stress and helps me focus. So I couldn't do that very often, but every now and then, and when I can, still now, of course, whenever I can, that's my therapy, is go out in nature.
Yeah, absolutely.
Amanda's in her yoga. I'm in my kung fu. Next time we'll kind of, be doing our things. We'll be thinking about you in the mountains there. One thing also that I wanted to ask you, you have worked a lot on the empowerment of women. As far as I understand, particularly when it comes to economic issues, in particular, trade issues. Could you give us a sense of where do you think we stand, actually, when it comes to women leadership and what more can be done in this respect?
Well, we are not in a good place. Actually, we are moving backwards because we are now considering the fight for equality, which is what this is about. And equality is about democracy. That's what it is. In the end, if we are not equal and we live in the same place, this is not democratic. So I see this fight as a fight to strengthen democracies. And now this fight has been captured by those who pretend that this is another form of cultural war, and that those that fight for gender equality are in reality woke. This word that means so little, but that everyone now uses as if it wasn't the biggest insult. Well, yes, I am woke. I believe in equality. And I believe in equality because I want to live in a society that considers that all its citizens have the same rights. It's an unfinished business. And maybe, Nathalie, I would tell you that what I have learned is that we have to be very careful to make sure this is not a battle of women for women with women, that we make this a battle for our societies, working together with men, with boys, with young men who are now being told that this is a fight against them. No, it's not against them. It's for stronger democracies. So yeah, I'm very passionate about this because at the end of the day, there is no reason why we should accept inequalities in the 21st century in whichever shape or form, starting with the inequalities between men and women.
I completely agree. Well, as we have marched through every phase of your career, we will wrap up the podcast on your current phase, which is in academia. So all three of us have now left behind the world of government and moved into the world of academia. And a large reason that Nathalie and I started this podcast is because we have many students, as I'm sure you do as well, who are interested in public service, or the case for many American students, thought they were going to go into public service, and now organizations like AID and others don't exist. And so I'm curious what advice you would give, especially to our young listeners, to your students, about how to think about the future of public service.
We discuss this a lot. And my message is always not to accept, to choose between those who tell these young students that the world is as it is, and therefore, there's nothing you can do, just accept it. Or the other choice, which is, the world as you would love it to be, the world would be, well, would we make the world to be? The message is one of agency. And I worry a lot that the way in which we frame our political discussions, the way we debate in our societies is taking agency away from people, is taking agency away from our young colleagues, is taking agency away from students. And I want to make sure they feel empowered, that they feel they have agency. The world will be what we make of this world. There is nothing inevitable. It's what we do. And therefore, the question is, ensure that they are in the best position to shape this world. And what is that best position is to understand the enormous nuances in our world. It's not just the black and the white, that there are enormous shades of gray in the middle, all these nuances that I think it's important that they understand, that they unpack, that they own, because in the end, it's the nuances that they will have to deal with. It's with the nuances that they will have to make trade-offs. And it's with these nuances that they will be capable of shaping the world. So for me, it's empowerment and agency that matters a lot today.
And, alongside empowerment and agency, to kind of, end with a little spark of joy, could you share with us perhaps one thing that has made you smile over the last few days?
I went to a great exhibition that has just ended in Paris. It's a great German painter, Gerhard Richter. Incredibly beautiful paintings, super inspirational. Paris is a great city to do that. And after visiting the exhibition, a great dinner with a bunch of friends. That is a great way to end a tough week. Arts, friends.
That is wonderful, Arancha. Well, thank you so much for this. Thanks for actually what has been an incredible, joyful, hopeful, and really rather optimistic conversation, which is, I must say, not exactly the usual kind of conversation that
we need to have you back more often.
Remember, it's not optimism or pessimism, it's activism.
Activism. So thank you, Arancha, for that agency, empowerment, and activism. And I hope all of you have enjoyed as much as Amanda and I have listening to Arancha today. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Power and Purpose is an IE Insights podcast produced in association with IE University and Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Production and sound design by Reptile Studios. We'll be back soon with the next episode. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing to Power and Purpose wherever you get your podcasts.